It's fair to say that when one comes to consider topics that can get people's backs up or get a little bit prickly, well, possibly politics and religion are two of those high scorers. And it's fair to say that our next guest is somebody who arguably does have a number of key issues with respect to the Bible in particular. Born into a Jewish family, raised in Sweden, refugees from Austria, moved there after the Second World War. We're, of course, referring to a gentleman who had a fine career in international tax consulting and then actually produced the text, Why Is It We Are Afraid of Being Descendants of Monkeys but Not Incest? Okay, let's actually take this through to its next step. And welcome to the program, the wonderful author and religious critic, Harry Margulies. How are you, Harry?
I'm fine, thank you. And so nice of you to invite me.
Well, good to connect with your good self. Now, it's intriguing this because reading through, obviously, your text, you've obviously studied the scriptures for a considerable period of time and have come up with this interesting conclusion, which, again, I think most folk would say, yeah, the Bible is, it's written over centuries. It's been put together. You have the New Testament, you have the Old Testament, you have a whole range of aspects there. It shows arguably the best of mankind or humanity. It shows the worst of humanity. But maybe you also need to, just as you wouldn't necessarily hand the unexpurgated version of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels to a young child and expect them to appreciate the nuances and the challenges of some of Swift's comments there. Maybe you also need to be very careful, obviously, before you actually say, here you are, my little 6-year-old, here, have a read of this.
Absolutely. Listen, when I had to choose what my book was going to be called, I chose it because here is one of the big parameters that I'm looking at, the unscientific Bible that people are supposed to believe in. So, for instance, why is it we're afraid of being descendants of monkeys? And everybody who is Christian is, but they don't mind that we all come from incest. And just with that starting point alone, we have a good start. And I sort of let you ask the questions and for me not to rant, please.
Okay. I mean, I've got to say, in essence, I think that's a huge generalization there. There are an awful lot of people who have a specific faith, and it is very much rooted in the Judeo-Christian background that connects together, who would actually take issue and say that actually they have no challenge whatsoever with the kind of caricatures we saw with Archbishop Wilberforce, and of course the arguments of the 19th century when Charles Darwin was obviously being hauled over the coals for daring to suggest that evolution or the theory of natural selection was actually there. And of course, we had the ludicrous statement of when the world was created round about tea time on a precise date, precise time, etc., etc. And of course, there's the literal translation and the people who would actually maintain that it's a literal manifestation of a historical fact, etc., which I think most scholars would turn around and say, actually, no, we're not arguing with that. So I think just as we have lots of shades of opinion or lots of variations in terms of viewpoints there, I think unless you're being deliberately controversial, Harry, in which case that's fine. We know where you're coming from.
Listen, let me move on from this though and say that it is disturbing to me that people are told to believe that every day of the Bible now means an eon of time. There's no evidence for that. There's only in the New Testament that a day is 1,000 years, which is far from enough. But let's leave that. I did get your point, and I appreciate that you are this well prepared. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So let me move on to, even if it's deemed to be metaphor, how bad is the text? And if this would have been a movie or an ordinary book, what would people have said? Right in the beginning, after the creation, the first son kills his brother, and he gets to be a wonder in the world. And the next thing that happens is God protects him with a mark so he doesn't get killed. Killed by whom? There was nothing but his family to begin with. So where do we stand on that? How do we stand with... Oh, please go. Sorry.
No, I'm just thinking, in essence, obviously, the mark of Cain, the punishment of that, the rationale of the whole sort of sequence. In many ways, we actually have, as indeed a medieval mystic, Julian of Norwich would actually have quoted, we have the fall, then we have the recovery from the fall. And once again, I think it could certainly be argued that in terms of the way in which we see the biblical text, yes, they are graphic. Why do you think Cecil B. DeMille filmed the Ten Commandments? It's great. It's a way forward within that whole sort of sequence. And there is this fascination, obviously, with respect to the ways in which certainly within Western culture, and arguably, obviously, we've got we've got Orthodox, we've got Western culture. Again, the other aspect, which I can almost hear some of our listeners sort of saying, yes, and what about the comparative religious aspects of the Quran and the aspects relating to that? This is part of human nature, surely, that actually blood, guts, violence, vengeance, revenge, unsavory activities, uncivilized activities in many ways, isn't that just part of the human condition?
Well, if it is, then why, for instance, when two angels come to visit Lot, who is one of the righteous men in Sodom and Gomorrah, they come to what is called in the Bible to know the two male angels, which you know what that means. And then what Lot does for God is to offer up his virgin daughters for rape. I mean, let's put it in plain language. This is quite awful. And I know that so many say that you should take it as allegory. Give me an example, and this is a rhetorical question, of course, you're committing the interview here. What is the moral lesson for us in this? What is it we're learning from this? What is we are learning when masturbation or self-knowing, whatever we want to call it, is deemed sinful? There's no teenagers who can live through that. And I have seen a Swedish TV program recently where youngsters have gone to wash their hands in scalding water to get rid of the feeling of sin. Is really that what we want? Is it even what we want in the moral lesson, just to continue with Lot, that when he finally escaped and his wife was turned into a pillar of salt, which probably was money at the time, the daughters liquor him up and seduce him to get pregnant. If anybody can tell me there are moral lessons in that, I'll be prepared to listen.
Well, of course, there are lots of perspectives that can be used to analyze texts from a whole variety of things. There is, of course, the reading of the Bible, which actually I think a certain Mr. Von Daniken used to put together, that actually it was all chariots of the gods. It was all examples of alienation. I mean, there is, of course, an acronym I've frequently used for the Bible, which is it's a basic instruction booklet for the life experience. And life is messy. Life is challenging. Having said that, again, going back to the original notion, of course, before you could even begin to understand, but even to actually relate the whole notion of metaphor, surely you have to actually be mature enough to actually work through this. This is one of the reasons where, in essence, are you not arguing just for censorship of texts to actually sort of say that, well, maybe we should actually even consider doing a Fahrenheit 451 and burning the Bible?
Well, listen, if you burn the Bible, nothing happens to you. You brought up Quran before. If you burn the Quran, you're in big trouble. So, I mean, there are comparative issues with all of this. And I'm taking your point to a next level and asking back generally, why couldn't God be clear, give us an understanding of a text that he wanted us to understand, and we would have one religion, we wouldn't have needed theologians, we wouldn't have needed apologists, we would just all have understood and no fighting in his name. That's not the case. On the contrary, our good God, he gives us trickery that he condones, and not only condones, but rewards. Like Jacob tricks his almost blind father together with his mother and gets away with it. And the end is not that God says, what did you do? No, God says, well, since you got father's blessing, they're now yours, and I will make you the one running the nation forward. There are issues with this. And of course, when you are under 18 and you're very vulnerable, and say that you have gay tendencies, are you now supposed to learn that you can never have physical love?
Again, in terms of the way in which we take a literal approach to the Bible, I mean, I just think it's fascinating. And obviously, I'm not setting up this as a polarized debate. Otherwise, we would have sort of opened up a whole range of things. But I'm just a little bit concerned, Harry, that in terms of the notion of actually taking the Bible as literal truth, which I mean, I think it's fair to say, if you actually were to talk about this with any of the main leaders, whether it be Pope Francis, whether it be Justin Welby, any of the line, they would say, of course, it's not meant to be taken literally. It can't be meant to be taken literally. And in terms of, say, the topics that are actually there, of course, there is the notion, dare I say it, Shakespeare. We have Troilus and Cressida. We have children being boiled alive in a cake within that. We have all manner of tragedies and challenges within that. Should we actually honestly say, well, actually, the same way you need to certificate the Bible, same thing with respect to Shakespeare. Very dodgy language there.
Absolutely. And you ask a really good question. Shakespeare isn't God. And there's a big difference. There are so many.
There are some people who might maintain otherwise, actually,
well,
Harry.
There are some people. I have made a case that if we would make Harry Potter to God, we would have Harry Potter churches, Harry Potter sins, and theologies develop to get rid of these sins. In my book, I have a chapter where I describe a made-up religion by me, all female. There's a female God called Extraordinary. And all that God wants is for you to stand on one leg 4 times a day and look up at heaven. And then theology develops in 2 different areas. Which leg to stand on? What if you don't have a leg to stand on? What if you need to hold yourself? Can you be covered up? Can you be held by somebody? Can you lean on something? 2 theologies develop, and after a number of years, they start fighting over who has the true faith. There's a difference between Shakespeare and what happens in the name of God. But I appreciate your questions.
And in terms certainly of religion, in essence, which is not created by God and is certainly a human invention, that binding together of people has certainly been responsible for both good and evil. And that binary opposition that we clearly have is, again, often at the heart of people's concerns and challenges. And sometimes actually taking a step back, if we say, again, if we look at the New Testament, you see almost a completely different aspect of this, as in the writings of Paul of Tarsus and his particular sort of take on the whole thing. And again, that whole notion of developing and evolving in terms of our life experience. Interesting, you mentioned obviously the Harry Potter scenario. Of course, it was well known fact that in many parts of Middle America, Harry Potter books were being burned because actually they were seen as actually manifesting witchcraft and evilness and all sorts of J.K. Rowling scenario. And of course, ironically, J.K. Rowling herself has actually been cancelled now, to use the colloquial term, in terms of various aspects within that. I'd also draw attention to Naomi Alderman's book, The Power, in which she actually develops the whole notion of female-run religions and how that develops as well. These are narratives. These are meant to make us think. They're not meant, again, to be taken literally. They're meant to be, again, deconstructed, analyzed, not as they take it as a panacea, but surely they're actually just meant to actually deal with, yes, there are challenges, but you can find moral inconsistencies and logical errata in a James Bond movie, in an Ian Fleming text. Ultimately, isn't it a way in which we read these things, and that proliferation of meaning, the preferred reading, surely isn't it up to the individual?
Well, everything is, unless you are young and you are indoctrinated, and if you have a father who is abusing you, and you will be deemed to die if you don't honor your father and mother. There's a difference between sort of plain literature and this. You touched on 2 things that I would like to respond to, if you will give me the time. One is the Pope. The Pope has issued a number of prayers. He still issues prayers. One of them was when the pandemic was new, and I wrote about that in my book. And he says he puts out a prayer for God to stop the coronavirus with his hands. Now, isn't that a bit ridiculous? He allowed it in the first place. So what is it that will make God do something about it now? He has put out prayers for Christians to fast and pray, for the Taliban to have a better rule. Nothing has happened. Now there's prayer for the situation in Ukraine. It is sort of late. There is a belief system in this that makes people actually act as if it were true. I do like your points of view. They are excellent. This is one of the best interviews I've been in. So thank you for that. The second point I want to make, there is a lot of confirmation bias here. And the New Testament, with all the stuff it has, 2 things. How can, and I'm taking it not in order, Satan tempt Jesus with what Jesus has anyway, being God and the Son of God? Of course, the excuse is he can step in and out of being just man and not man, which is sort of, may I say, ridiculous. The other point is in the John 3:16, which everybody points to, how much God loves this world. So he sacrifices his son in order to forgive us. And if it would have said, and God so loved his people that he forgave us without sacrifice, would we have asked God for sacrifice? Is that the moral thing to do? So I'm just saying it is amoral. It is of a nature that creates harm. And in God's name, so much harm has been done. Looking at the text even, not that I believe in it, which you understand, God has committed all evil. And Satan has just about only tempted us with 10 kills on his hands and God with 2 million.
In terms of the line and the approach, I mean, Richard Dawkins obviously springs to mind in terms of obviously his analysis and his deeply felt concern, much as yourself, Harry, about obviously contemporary views in terms of religion. Let's just take the cultural side of things. Is there an argument that if we actually look at, shall we say, the belief systems of the Mayans or the Babylonians or the Aztecs or any particular civilization, which we have evidence that civilizations have risen, civilizations have fallen, maybe we're at the apex of our own civilization, maybe we're actually on a wheel that is turning in all sorts of other ways, etc. Surely there are certain fundamentals that we tend to agree on, that Mayan child sacrifice is wrong. I don't think they could actually blame the Bible for the particular choice of sacrificing children. But equally, in the same way, the whole notion of that sacrificial element that was there is a misreading and a misunderstanding, in a sense, of the general message, which overall, if you take the 10 Commandments, and indeed honor thy father and thy mother, and you take that as such, they are meant to be surely a good moral guide. Surely if you actually go back to fundamental principles with respect to treating other human beings as you'd like to be treated yourself, maybe the two Vladimirs could sort this thing through, Mr. Zelensky, and of course Mr. Putin, with their particular issues. Then maybe we just need to look upon that as a fundamental axiom. And when we come around to obviously the key point of the argument, which is, should the Bible be age registered? I mean, I'd argue in a real sense it is, because I would be very surprised if, anybody effectively was introduced to the Bible. I mean, obviously there are unfortunate cases where people have clearly misunderstood, either willfully or through a whole system, and have come up with their own particular perverted corruption. Martin Luther in the 1500s protests against the Pope actually is responded to by Henry VIII. That piece that Martin Luther also wrote, thanks to the printing press, also went on to be highly anti-Semitic. And the lines that Martin Luther wrote about in the 1500s were then used tragically for one of the horrors, the absolute aberrations of the 20th century with respect to the Nazi Party. In that instance, surely you've got a case of this is just really challenging. We need to look at it and say, what are the fundamental ways of not just the glib, let's just be nice to each other, but actually looking at the positives and making sure that you do couch the terms, as I said, with Gulliver's Travels, or indeed Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, which again is a much more diluted version of the whole thing, to say, what are the key core elements that come out across here? And you can use the same thing for Harry Potter and other texts as well.
Listen, you make a very good point. And if it were so easy that people would have read the Bible as literature only, I'm with you, but they don't. It is the higher moral lesson that whether it is in fact read as God's word or interpreted by theologians and apologists who are self-appointed and know God's word for us or not. So the difference is, there is a God who looks over your shoulder with anything you do. He looks angrily at most things. He is angry with you for generations, which it says himself in the Bible. And he has so incredibly many human traits. If you look at that as literature, as tragedy, and looking at all cultures, excellent. It is for the few people, or the many rather people who don't, and the children in Sunday school who get extremely indoctrinated and then have trouble making their way out of them. As a child, I was indoctrinated. I had rabbis going with me and I was fearful of God. It was a painful, painful process to rid myself of this. And I worked hard at it and have read more biblical text and more books about the Bible and of God, about Jesus, than most priests. And what do I find? I find about my book that priests are angry. They say, no, Catholics are not cannibals. It is no, it's not a metaphor. They say that transubstantiation converts the blood and a wafer to Jesus' blood and body. No, it's not. There's so many items like that, and I don't want to take up your time with all this, but you see what I'm saying? There is a belief that is damaging to you. It's damaging to your mind. Should you pray to solve a problem, or should you deal with it?
It's intriguing you mentioned belief, because belief systems are surely at the heart of history in general. That history is often regarded as one system of beliefs that supersedes another system of beliefs. Maybe we are actually in a challenging time now. And again, we certainly had two of the most diametrically opposed belief systems, which ended up actually pretty much being on the same edge of the continuum, both extreme communism and extreme capitalism, or indeed fascism, that can be actually seen again emerging, both ironically from the survival of the fittest scenario. Even H.G. Wells was somewhat taken aback when it was pointed out to him by, I believe, Aldous Huxley, that actually what he'd been advocating in many of his writings for a series of philosopher Plato-like kings and scientists who actually rule society, that elite society, was pretty much what actually led to, obviously, the establishment of Stalin and indeed the whole notion of Hitler, both of whom, ironically, possibly also had their own challenges with religion, because I believe they both actually originally were intended to be priests. Maybe the world would have been a better place if they had gone into the priesthood. I'm just saying. Yeah. Harry, it's been fascinating sharing some thoughts with respect to this. I suppose I could say, when you were actually working as a tax analyst, obviously tax is one of those areas that often also irritates people, etc. Did you feel at that sort of stage, well, it's good to know that I'm following in the footsteps of St. Matthew?
In some ways, listen, what I learned from my tax practice, which was mostly international, is to read text for what it says and not what somebody tells me. And I think I've used the same process when I read holy text, and I say, don't disregard the fact that this is actually text picked by man, although it is supposed to be for God. And that is my case. I thank you so much.
Harry, it's been awesome connecting with you, good self. The text, of course, is, why is it? ? We are afraid of being descendants of monkeys, but not incest. You can presumably find it on most standard bookstores, etc. Does it have an 18 rating, though, Harry?
No, it doesn't. And I got to tell you, it's quite okay. I didn't use too much that needed an 18 rating. It is definitely not more controversial than the Bible.
Well, what a strapline that would be. Definitely not more controversial than the Bible. Harry Margulies, huge thanks. Many thanks indeed. Take care and keep on keeping on.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.